Raising up our voice for unity. Here in the now, I am hearing the now as I listen, and I listen, and I listen. The sound that goes on up on up. Can you hear now? In the here and now, you hear the song of the earth. She was singing in the side, in the circle round with the sound that carries the ancient memory constantly, gracefully. Calling us to heal now, stewards are we from the inner world to the world we see. Raising up our voice for unity. Here in the now, I am hearing the now as I listen, and 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 I listen.
Aloha Internet, it's Eurosoul here. Greetings to everyone on Steam, on ureka.org, on every site, everywhere. Really, it's just one human experience being shared by all of us through technology. So it's that time of year again when people declare that it's Christmas time, and we see all the lights coming up in shopping areas as the companies try to extract money from people's pockets for things they probably mostly don't need. And also the time of year, more heartwarmingly, when people come together and set aside their differences and, some might say, act like real humans, setting aside the mass slaughter of animals, which really is quite inhumane. My version of Christ and Christmas is a little bit different to the mainstream, well, actually very different. And I was just reminded of this when someone asked me to explain a comment I made about the connection of Christ to crystals. Which I'm going to cover in this video. So, unexpectedly, I mean, when I went to school, I was kind of indoctrinated into Christianity a bit. I didn't really pay much attention to it. I didn't really understand the logic behind it. It didn't really make much sense to me. I could see obvious flaws in it, and the feeling that I had inside myself was basically, which I at that time felt to be a divine kind of connection, basically saying to me, no, don't pay any attention to this. If it doesn't feel right, teach yourself. If it doesn't feel right, it isn't right for you personally. And the feeling that I had was far more divine. It felt more truthful. It basically felt like you're fine as you are. When these people tell you you're not good enough unless you do X, Y, Z, and you're going to be punished by God and all this stuff, none of that's true. And I would always trust my own gut and feeling over what other people are telling me, especially when I see those people that are telling me this stuff who I don't see any power in them, no compassion, no wisdom, no balance. I feel like I have, and the people I trust have more in us than they do. So why would I listen to them? Especially when what they're saying doesn't even make sense to me. So, but anyway, I was still forced to listen to it all because I didn't really have much choice in terms of, the situation back then. Anyway, once I left school, I didn't pay any attention to religion at all until a certain point when I was about 21, when I had been learning a little bit here and there about Buddhism, but not really very much. And I went through some very unusual experiences, which I've written a book about, which is unpublished. I will publish it at some point. Which ultimately, I've spoken about this before online, it ultimately led to me having close encounters with what most people would call UFOs. I call them light ships, and I personally think that they're actually conscious. The ones that I've contacted or contacted me are a form of consciousness made manifest. Basically, they are pre-matter plasma, so they appear very light, very bright in the sky. It was nighttime when I saw them, and to me, I don't see them as being things that have bodies in them as such. I see them as actually sentient conscious forms. They just don't have a shape like a human because I don't need it, because they're not as dense as we are. This is a massive subject, and I'm not really going to go too deeply into that, but the point is I really did have some very unusual experiences during that period, and some of that was connected to my study of it. Really, I was combining together science with spirit, and looking at history and ancient structures and mathematics and so on all at once, making music as well at the same during the same sort of period of time. Only a few days actually, but it just so happened that all of these things synced up together, and I had some very powerful and profound experiences. And part of that was understanding. I know that some people have. I think someone said the other day about Einstein. Suddenly, when he was asked how did he understand relativity and these things, he said that I mean, I don't know if this is true, but this is what someone said, that basically he realised, he had sort of a download, he had a realisation in one moment of all of this huge amount of information, and it took him years to actually be able to translate that into something that could be explained to other people. That's what happened to me, that's what I experienced. It's just, it wasn't about gravity, it was about, I mean, it does tie into the material of the universe and physics and things like this, but it also ties into the history, the past, what ancient people thought and knew. In other words, a lot of the subjects that people talk about now online with regards to ancient temples and sacred geometry and all these things, I kind of realised in literally within about 3 or 4 seconds the equivalent of what you would need to take 6 months maybe of research online to start to understand. When you tap into that divine source of information, and you're ready to receive it, and it can enter you in the right way, then you don't have the kind of resistance to that information that you do typically when you're learning from an internet page or something like that, or a book. Resource, that's what you're looking at when you're resourcing something. When you're looking at resources on the internet and in books, you are resourcing something. However, when you get the information from the source, which some people call God, the source of the universe, the source of everything that exists, then there's no thought process needed. You're just getting a direct you're directly being infused with information and knowledge. So that's what I experienced, and I never really noticed I'd experienced that before, and it was just a huge experience for me in so many ways. I wasn't really ready for it, wasn't planning to do it. It just occurred, and it literally took me. I mean, you can make a movie out of what happened after that, pretty much, but after 10 years, maybe, I would say, of a combination of healing myself as a result of what I experienced following that, and also just things I needed to heal myself from anyway, plus also doing research into what other people had said and thought about the kind of things I was now looking into, I came to be in a position where I could formulate an understanding and express these things to other people in a way that's coherent and is helpful. And ultimately, the book that I started writing, which I will publish, will really go into depth on this, and really much more than I can put into videos. But what I want to cover here is what I've learned and concluded about Christ and what Christ is. So we have the idea of Jesus Christ, and for many people that's the extent of Christ. I think that's what they think Christ is. They literally think Christ is a man. From my perspective, that's not what Christ is, and I'm going to explain some of the logic that you can think about which might help you understand that. So if you have a human being who, let's say for this example, is Jesus or Yeshua or whatever name you want to give him, he was a healer and man, and we could go through the story of his life, but the point is he's classed as being Christ or Christed. And some people say that that means he was God, some people say that that means he was the Son of God, the Son of God, like there's only one for some reason. Some people say that he was embodying Christ's consciousness, and I am much more in alignment with that, much more in agreement with that definition, that is actually more accurate no matter how you look at it, that he was embodying Christ's consciousness. And by that I mean a level of consciousness and awareness and understanding which enabled him to become empowered to do such things as were called miracles. I would personally not use the word miracle. I would use the word, I don't have a problem with using the word magic, but in short, my understanding now is that the ability to do these very unusual acts or cause unusual phenomena to manifest is the result of balance. It's the result of a high level of balance and strong intention and a willingness and a knowingness of the ability to do it, and other things as well. But it's certainly not limited to just one person. And if one person can do it, then I don't see any reason why most people can't do it. And in fact, I'm probably not going to remember the exact quote, but there's a quote from biblical text where Jesus essentially says, "These things that I've done, so shall you do, and more," effectively. In other words, the miracles that you see me doing, other people are going to be doing this in the future too, and you're going to go beyond what I've done. And I agree with that. and I think that assuming that he did say that logic is coming from Christ consciousness. It's coming from the understanding that he knows how he's doing these things, and therefore he knows that other people can do it as well. You're willing to correct me if you're wrong. If I'm wrong on that, I'm definitely not a biblical scholar. Perhaps I'm missing something key there, but that's my interpretation on that. So what is it that Christ consciousness is? How is it that Christ consciousness exists? What is it? Why do we not have it usually? And so on. So I find that there are several tools that are easily accessible we can use to understand this, which I never really hear other people talking about, or very rarely. So I like to look at language. I like to look at words and the origin of words, and I like to fill in the gaps where the origins of words don't make sense, and also where I can just see patterns that make more sense. Maybe there's things about our language which are showing us important truths which we aren't picking up on. And if we look at the word Christ, it's very similar to the word crystal. And we know that crystals not only make attractive jewellery, but they're used in our technology, in our computers, in our smartphones, in our watches, and without them we wouldn't really have any of the technology we're even using to run the internet. So they're very significant. Actually, they're not just pretty bits of kind of see-through material. And if you crush them with a pair of pliers, for example, they will emit electricity. They're piezoelectric. They're very interesting material, probably one of the most interesting types of material on planet Earth. So that's interesting, really, isn't it? We've got the word Christ that's associated with being divine and kind of miraculous and powerful, and then we've got crystals, which are almost in a way the physical manifestation of that. We use technology to do things which people in the past would have considered magical or mystical or miraculous. Obviously, if we were to say to somebody hundreds of years ago, oh, well, we can now, you could talk to somebody on the other side of the planet with no problem, probably a lot of them are going to think you're crazy and just say it's impossible. There's no way that's possible, kind of thing. But obviously it is, and that's all thanks in a way to crystals. But when we look at crystals under an electron microscope, which I'm going to show you now, you'll see something interesting. There we go. So these are images of you can see I've searched up here, crystal lattice electron microscope. So under a very high power microscope, when you look at crystals, you will see this kind of thing, which is a very, very, very regular repeating pattern of molecules that make up the crystal being in a perfect or near perfect alignment. And that's in essence part of why we can see through crystals. But this is interesting, is it not? So crystals are built on lattice structure, on perfect alignment between the molecules that make them up. So what does that mean for us? So perhaps is it not logical then to say that a Christed being possibly might have a similar kind of quality to them? They might also have an alignment within them in some way. So what is an alignment? Well, the word truth, if you think about the word truth in the context of engineering or artistry, carpentry, so on, if you have an object, like let's say a piece of wood you're working on, and you are attempting to shape it in a certain way, measure it, cut it in the correct way according to your plan, then, or template, then you can say that your cut is true, or the angle you've measured is true, it's accurate, it's in alignment with that which you're attempting to match it up to. So we have a relationship between alignment and truth. And that's the same if we go back to imagining that crystal lattice pattern, you can say that each of the lines in that lattice are true to each other. So when we come back to an individual being, we also understand that we can have truth in us, or we can be aligned to something. We could be aligned to a certain ideology or a belief system or a direction, or numerous different things we in some way could be aligned to. So everyone has some sort of an alignment in them, regardless of anything at all. They might have an alignment towards nihilism, towards anything, basically. I mean, that some way you can't really exist without being aligned in some way to something, I would say, unless you're almost dead or unconscious. So how does Christ alignment define itself, or how do we define it? And I'm going to show you now another image, which this is one that I actually made using Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, famous painting or diagram. And what I've done is overlay on top of this a template structure which is meant to represent what's called the chakra system. And many people are aware of the ancient teachings about chakras. They don't all agree with each other, and I personally think that a lot of the teachings on the internet are mistaken and wrong regarding chakras. But one thing generally that is agreed upon is that there's a certain number of primary energy centers in the body running up the spine and out the top of the head, which each represent and each govern or symbolize, depending on how you want to think about it, a different set of energies within us, a different quality, a different set of skills and attributes and so on. And within yoga and lineage-based yoga, and within certain spiritual traditions and teachings and schools and so on, we have the idea of aligning the chakras. And just so you know, in case you aren't aware, the red one at the bottom here is called the root in English, and it's the kind of relates to survival issues. It's in a sense it's the core of beingness in a way. It's the if that goes, if you've got a problem with that, then you're going to have difficulty even surviving. It's the base. It's the really. I mean, all of these are important, but this one gets a little bit underrated. Due to its association with sexuality and the heavy judgments against sexuality that people have given. Often people in some schools people are taught to even try and negate and deny these centers and get rid of them completely in favor of these royal and spiritual purple and blue colors. In reality, we need all of these colors. That's why there's a spectrum here and a rainbow, and you can't have anybody who knows anything about physics and light and so on understands that just because you can produce a rainbow from light doesn't mean to say there's nothing in that that's a judgment that says one of those colors is better than the other. They're just all components of from the same source ultimately. So the point though is that, for example, the next one up here is let me get this right. You've got crown. You've got well, this is actually the one above crown. This is the sort of higher self one. But crown, indigo, third eye. You've got throat. You've got heart. You've got solar plexus. You've got sacral. So this, I associate this with will, basically, personal choice, and a kind of gut, visceral sense of what we need and want. And then the yellow one here, solar plexus, is soul. Solar plexus, soul. It's kind of a sense of self and a sense of being able to take that gut energy and actually start to make more tangible sense of it in terms of how it applies to reality as you're experiencing it in the present moment. Heart is the balancing center of all of this stuff, which we'll come back to. Throat, on one level, is your communication center. It's your ability to express and actually shape matter as well through vibration. Your third eye is tallies up with the pineal gland in the brain, and is essentially reflective of your inner vision, your insight, your awareness of internal realities, and so on. Crown is often said to be a kind of divine chakra. It's like, it's a transcendent self-realization kind of level. I personally experience it that more as being it's a very spiritual aspect of self. It's less physical than these ones. For me, it's a doorway into this one, in a way, which is my actual spirit. It's the higher self. It's the part that carries on when you pass on, when the physical body dies, and the aspect of you that continues on beyond that moves out. Ultimately, in a sense, your awareness and focus is being drawn up into the faster vibrating energy form of yourself, which you could say is formless, actually. From our human perspective, when we view that tunnel of light and we enter into it, it's not always obvious what exactly is at the other end. I do know roughly what's there, having explored it myself internally, but certainly I think it's much bigger than I have experienced. However, so each of these centers can potentially be imbalanced and overpower each other. So for example, you could have perhaps an upper center such as your imagination not being balanced through the heart with your real felt needs. So you might be walking around daydreaming and imagining all these inner visions and concepts which aren't tallying up with what you really need on a felt level. So your body might need more exercise, more rest, whatever it might be, but your imagination might be completely ignoring that and just going off and imagining all kinds of things without really connecting. So that would be an example where these lower centers would be pushed out of place, let's say, or squashed and compressed and not able to be providing the full function and energetic flow that we need them to. The heart is meant to be the balancing point of this system, so the upper centers here feed into the heart and the lower centers feed into the heart, and in your heart is where you're able to bond thoughts and emotions in a loving way so that nothing is being overpowered. So your feelings get to be heard, your imagination and your insights from your mind and your more logical and spiritual aspect also have a voice, and then together they can come together in your heart and you can feel and think about what's right for you. So when you are in full alignment and all of these energy centers are present and empowered and let's say flowing correctly, then you're a very powerful individual. You're very capable of manifesting reality. You are healthy, you are strong, you aren't very likely to be troubled by many things. Most people are not in that state. Most people are really very different, in fact, as I understand it. Typically, most people have very heavily injured energy centers, specifically the lower ones. The individual will of most people is very overpowered and denied, such that they don't have much of a sense of direction in life, they don't have much connection to intuition, they don't understand emotions, they don't really know how to survive very well. I mean, if our industrialized world were to collapse for some reason, let's say we run out of oil or some other thing that this system relied on, then most people would not only not know how to survive from the planet, but wouldn't have access to the things they even needed to do that. If you needed to get into the earth and grow food to survive, how would you do it? I mean, I've deliberately learned how to do that, but it's not something that most people have learnt. I mean, really, in a sane society, this stuff would be taught in schools. It would be one of the main subjects taught in schools, but we don't live in well, I don't live in a sane society. Britain is not, and most westernized sort of countries are not, in my opinion, sane. They're, in terms of how we talk to think and how we teach children. But in fact, that's an excellent example of how lack of an alignment can be seen to manifest in reality. So, the upper centers, which typically European people are more focused into, which is why we have the sort of idea of royal blue and royal purple and so on, and the church colours sort of thing. When you're up in those energy centers, things can seem a certain way. You can think things are a certain way, and you think certain truths are more important than others. And you sit in your office or your church, wherever it is, you don't really get very much into contact with the earth, with the ground, with dealing with actual physical tasks. It's much more mental. So you can be thinking that you're perfectly safe and you've made all these great decisions and you're the smartest person on the earth and everyone's working for you around the world even. But it won't take much for that house of cards to fall apart, and ultimately often that house of cards is being held together by violence on a certain level, whether it's through the police or military or whatever it is. It's not being held together by love or coherent and balanced understandings, let's say. So the fact that we don't teach children about how to grow food to survive, but we do teach them about learning certain languages, which there's nothing wrong with certain languages, but it's a lot less important than how to survive. There's many other subjects that you could pull out which they are important subjects, but they're much less important than knowing how to survive. So we've got this over-reliance on the sort of upper centres, in a sense, in our culture. So that would, in terms of how that relates back to a crystal and Christ alignment, if you imagine, what would a crystal look like if some of the centers in it, the atoms, were, or molecules, were not the same as the other ones? They weren't in alignment. Well, you would have, probably you wouldn't be able to have a crystal, because it would just fall apart. It wouldn't be able to maintain its structure, I imagine. I mean, I'm not a material scientist. I don't know exactly what would happen. I'm just picturing it in my mind. Certainly you wouldn't have a standard sort of crystal where it's semi-transparent and has the properties that are inherent with alignment. So when we are fully aligned, and that means balanced, and that means all of our elements are working together in coherence and balance, we can be said to be either or close to being Christed, or being in alignment with Christ, or the crystal self, you might call it, crystal consciousness. And if you think about the properties of crystal, crystals are thought, we have the phrase crystal clear, for example. So when your channels are balanced, your own consciousness becomes clear. Things become clear, understandings are clear, you understand things clearly, you can express things clearly, you can think clearly. And that is ultimately one of the qualities of Christ consciousness. In a way, it's simply being your full self. It's when you lack the distortions that inhibit you typically from being able to embody all of these qualities. It's not like you're automatically suddenly walking around with a pair of angel wings and listening to God all day long, like God FM, in your brain, although you can hear God through those channels. Ultimately, I should point out that when I say God, I don't mean God like as in the version of God that's typically described by Christianity in churches, often in the literal sense of a kind of sky god or whatever you want to call it. To me, I mean, everybody is entitled to have their own definition of God, and I'm not trying to say that my one's right and yours is wrong. For me, God is everything. So God is manifest in you, God is manifest in me, God is manifest in the earth, God is manifest in men, God is manifest in women, God is manifest in cows, God is manifest in snails. These are just different forms of the essence of which God is. And however, I do also understand that there's been a split basically in the universe, so that wasn't deliberate, which has caused the spiritual components of God to be a bit unnaturally separate from the physical components. And that's again the same pattern I was describing here previously with the chakras, where the upper ones have separated from the lower ones, or they're out of balance. So the more that we balance ourselves, the more we individually become Christed as expressions of the infinite, as expressions of God, the more we heal the universe and God, basically. So the idea that God is perfect and infallible and simply you can't question that is itself an error. If you understand, and basically, if you understand that God has made everything and/or is everything, then it's impossible, really, for you to stand, and it's impossible for you to use logic coherently and maintain the position that God is infallible. Because if you say that God's creativity created the mistakes that we've experienced and the suffering, and that the justification for that is we were meant to learn from it, or maybe we're being punished or something like that, and so therefore it is all perfect because you need to have these lessons in order to learn what you need to learn, that ultimately kind of doesn't allow for the possibility that you, as an expression of the infinite and of God, are only expressing the same kind of qualities that God, him, her, itself has already had to go through. How does God know you need to learn these things unless God has already learned these things, him, herself? So the only logical explanation for that, in a sense, is to say that, well, God knows everything already, and doesn't learn anything, and that is really, I suppose, the justification that's used for referencing these old books, because it's kind of like, well, God knew everything then, God knows everything now, and so you can rely on those older books because nothing's changed from God's perspective. But then you know yourself that you have free will and that what you're doing in life is open to change. You can choose direction. So what they're really saying then, if God knows everything and everything about you and what you can and can't and will and won't do, then that means your life is pointless because it's already understood anyway. You can't learn anything and you can't really achieve anything. So what's the point? And that just isn't how it is. Basically, if you know, there is no evidence to back that up as far as I'm concerned. There is only evidence to back up the idea that, and the understanding that before there was the universe, before when there was only darkness, there was still beingness, there was still existence, but it was not conscious. It had not learnt the things that consciousness knows now. Just like I had not learnt the things I know now that I knew that when I was a child, when I was a baby. Everything is going through an evolutionary creative process and learning as it goes, and that includes the essence known as that Christians might call God. This is a massive subject, obviously. It is confusing in a sense because, as I understand it, there are actually, we could use the word fragments, but entities, individual entities that could be identified, which have embodied a lot of the actual kind of core essence of that which creates the universe. In other words, there are entities that exist which, when compared to an individual human, seem godlike, much more so than a human does. And some humans have encountered those apparently in history and have said, "Oh, I've met God." They haven't realised that they are also part of God. And to understand how this is even possible, you have to understand what happened before the universe was created, and how this creation has played out in terms of individuation and fragmentation of essence into multiple beings, the multiplicity from the one. How did that happen? That's a subject for another day, I guess. But so coming back to the chakras and alignment and Christ and all these things, I guess I would summarize it just by saying that Christ is a form of alignment to truth, to which basically means you yourself are balanced and in harmony, not only within yourself, within the sub parts of yourself, so that no part of yourself is overpowering any other part of yourself, but you're also not overpowering anything else in existence, and you have a connection, a felt connection and understanding that connects into the universe and to all living beings, such that you can understand them to some extent as well, and you know how to proceed in life and achieve your goals in a creative and loving way, as opposed to destroying things. Ultimately, you become one with the universe. You know that, and this is something that's been written about, in numerous spiritual texts, and people have had these experiences with or without religion. When you actually experience yourself as one with everything, it doesn't mean to say necessarily that you literally start seeing through the eyes of 6 trillion people, or however many people there are in the universe. It means, for me at least, in my experience, that you understand that you're one with everything. And it's not, you know that you are still the individual that you think yourself to be, but simultaneously you are also only experiencing as a human a small component of yourself expressing in this vehicle right now. And it is possible for you to connect into the bigger self, which is ultimately everything. And when you start to tune in your chakras and balance them and become aligned, that's when you start to tune in more to that aspect of yourself, which ultimately knows itself to be one with everything, and even experiences itself to be everything, which is ultimately a kind of God level of sentience and awareness. So, yeah, I mean, the idea of Christ as being very closely connected to God is correct, and the idea of energy and ideas and vibrations and attunement being able to be received and expressed through that medium of connection is correct. It's just that it isn't focused only into one human being. It's actually a divine right of all beings to experience that, and we are actually, as part of a evolutionary process, being guided to that. It's not like you need to win it, or it's only for the lucky few. It's actually meant to be for everyone. It should be just the normal state of being. It should be, in my opinion, just how we are. It shouldn't even be debatable. It's just that humanity has been so lost, hurt, and corrupted by itself and by various different influences and beliefs, judgments, blame, torturous acts, you name it, pretty much humanity's done it. We basically have lost the ability, many of us, to even think clearly, and we've basically damaged, let's put it this way, we've become so out of alignment with ourselves and with truth that we have lost, in many cases, the ability to get back to being aligned again. So we're so confused, we don't even know how to find the way home. So understanding this fundamental nature of our being and the structure of the soul, let's say, structure of self, is an important map on the road to wholeness and on the road to well-being and on the road to actual human evolution as well. So I'm sure you can appreciate that this kind of subject, we could talk about this I could talk about this for a very long time. I can go off in many different directions. We could talk about the way that this information was encoded into ancient structures on the earth. We can talk about the way that the maths involved is actually found in the earth and in the solar system. We could talk about the way this has been hidden from religions, so some of them. We can talk about how most of the religions are pointing to the same truths when you see it from this perspective. And then you can clearly pull out the lies and the half-truths that have been inserted into the religions. And you can feel the motivation for them being there, and you can find out the harm they've done to you and to the people around you. And you've got a very long healing journey to go on to heal the emotional and psychological effects that have entered into you as a result of all of these distortions. If you're a cracked, damaged and distorted piece of material, piece of matter, and your aim is to be crystal, or let's say carbon, it's a good analogy in a sense. If you're a piece of coal and you want to become a diamond, so people would say, well, you need a lot of pressure to turn that coal into a diamond. It's important. We all have a lot of pressure on us because that makes you a diamond. Well, if you're talking literally about carbon and diamonds, then potentially yes, although I think apparently there are ways of making diamonds without pressure. But when it comes to turning humans into a diamond, let's say metaphorically, into the crystal self, pressure is going to motivate you and drive you in a way to do these things, but you don't actually need to be pressured as such in a way that doesn't feel good. You can just basically choose through free will to actually align into a coherent, advanced, evolved version of yourself. That in itself is part of the evolution, the realization that force and control and dominance, they are a form of misalignment. You don't need to be forced and pressured to do things, to be a certain way. In fact, that's counterproductive. You need to move into that in a tranquil way that's right for you. So, I hope that's been helpful for you, and I hope I've been clear, and I feel like I've put across some important piece of information there. If you've got any questions about this, or you want to carry on the conversation, then you can always come to my page either on ureka.org, ureka.org, or to my blog on Steemit sites such as Steampeak, steempeak.com, where my username is urasol, ura-soul. And yeah, I'll be glad to talk to you about it, and I'm sure that this kind of information is going to become more widely understood in the coming years, and I'm looking forward to a time when children, when they go to their place of spiritual education, they find this kind of useful information instead of being told stories about how they're going to burn in hell if they touch their root chakra. So with that, much love to you and to all, and may we all have a merry Mass Christ.